This video will concentrate on certain types of factoring. We'll start with factoring by grouping. When we talk about factoring by grouping, obviously there's going to be some grouping involved. Take this polynomial. There's nothing common to any of it that can be taken out. There's no greatest common factor. But if we were to group these two terms together and look just at those two, we would notice there is a common factor between those two. We have a common y that we can pull out. Factoring out the common y, we're left with an x plus 5. Looking at the other two terms, we notice there's a common negative 3. Remember, anytime there's a leading negative, you want to make sure you factor it out. So we factor out the leading negative with the negative 3, and we're left with an x plus 5. Now we can notice we have a common quantity of x plus 5, and when we factor that out, we're left with y minus 3. That's the basics of factoring by grouping. If we look at this polynomial, again, we group these two terms, and we have a common x. Factoring out leaves us with y plus 2. We look at these two terms, and we notice, well, there's nothing common about those at all. But if we remember back to our discussion on greatest common factors, there's always a 1. No matter what else is going on, there's always a 1 that's common. So if we factor out a 1, it doesn't change anything there, but it gives us the opportunity to have something left. When we factor out the common quantity y plus 2, now we're going to be left with x plus 1. So remember, when we do the factoring by grouping, we always have to have something that can come out when we're doing this, even if it's only a 1. An important point to keep in mind is when you factor by grouping, the groups always have to be of the same size. So if we were to group these three terms together, which is fine, it doesn't have to be 2 terms. It can be as many as you want. But if we're going to group those 3 together, then we have to group those 3 together. And factoring then, we have a common z, leaving us with x plus y minus 2. We have a common negative 3 because of the leading negative, leaving us with z plus y minus 2. Factor out the common z, x plus y minus 2, and we're left with z minus 3. I just realized I made a mistake. I knew in my head what I meant, but I didn't write it that way. This was supposed to be an x, which would make this an x, which would actually make them common. That does bring out a point that's important to be aware of. Never force your factoring by grouping. Never just assume, well, those are close enough to the same. I had an x plus y minus 2 and a z plus y minus 2. That's not the same. If I had actually been reading what I was writing instead of talking over what I was writing, then I would have noticed those aren't the same, something's wrong. There will be times when it's not factorable, and that's okay. That's called prime. You just leave it as is. But if it is factorable, it's going to be exactly the same. You don't have to make it be the same. It will be the same. In this case, I had written my variable incorrectly. So when I correct that, now it's working. That's factoring that with 2 groups of 3. It could also be factored with 3 groups of 2. Let's say you don't like the arrangement there. You're not seeing the 2 groups of 3s. You could rearrange all the terms. You could rearrange all the terms if you wanted to. Get the x's together, and then get the y's together, and then get the 2's together. You have to be aware that the 2 and the 6 go together. Then we can see, well, I have a group of 2 there, a group of 2 there, and a group of 2 there. It doesn't matter how many terms are in a group, and it doesn't matter how many groups you have, as long as every group has the same number of terms. Up here we have 2 groups with 3 terms each. Here we have 3 groups with 2 terms each. It's going to work. Watch. Factor out a common x, we're left with z minus 3. Common y, we're left with z minus 3. Common negative 2, because of the leading negative, and we're left with z minus 3. Now we have a common z minus 3, and we can pull that out of all 3 terms, and we're left with x plus y minus 2. It's the same thing we got up there. Different order, but the exact same thing. So when we factor by grouping, we want to group things together. We can rearrange the terms in the polynomial to create groups that we like. We need to make sure that every group has the same number of terms, and then we factor out whatever's common in the group. Pull it out to the left, to the left, to the left. If there's nothing common, we have to pull out a 1. Once we do that, if there's any common quantities, we pull those out to the left, and we continue factoring until our factoring is complete.